started. So, peace of the Lord be with you.
And also with you.
This morning we're going to consider a poem of John Donne's called The Cross as a meditation on a theme that runs throughout religious writing from St. Paul on, called the Imitatio Christi, the imitation of Christ, or the Imitatio Crucis, the imitation of the cross. And even though Jesus himself doesn't say that we're supposed to imitate him, Jesus says we're supposed to follow him, take up our cross and follow him. St. Paul sort of elaborates. Should I move in closer? Is that better? Sure. Okay. St. Paul elaborates the theme that can be understood and comes to be Imitatio Christi. And I'll give you just a few passages where we see that. Sometimes this modeling of one's life after the pattern of Christ is implicit, as in 1 Corinthians 2, where St. Paul writes, "When I came to you, brothers and sisters, I did not come proclaiming the mystery of God to you in lofty words or wisdom, but I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified." Sometimes it's explicit, as in Philippians 3, 10 to 14, where we hear what might be understood as the Imitatio Crucis, life as the imitation of the cross. Here St. Paul writes, "I want to know Christ and the power of his resurrection and the sharing of his sufferings by becoming like him in his death, if somehow I may attain to the resurrection from the dead, pressing towards that goal, not that I have already obtained this or have already reached the goal, but I press on to make it my own, because Christ Jesus has made me his own." Lastly, Galatians 2. Here St. Paul frames the message that he is delivering in terms of Christ crucified, and that message is then mirrored in himself as the messenger, modeling himself on Christ's vulnerability, Christ who rests wholly in the solace and trust in the Father. And in keeping with that, St. Paul renounces his own strength, saying, "I have been crucified with Christ, and it is no longer I who live, but it is Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me." So there are all sorts of texts that take up this theme. Most famous is Thomas à Kempis' The Imitation of Christ, which is itself a collection of 4 separate treatises in which Thomas à Kempis treats how Christians are to sort of train themselves both internally and their perceptions of the world around them in terms of seeking after the things of God. Kempis wrote it about 1412. It was in print in 1473, and it had an influence on people like Luther. So John Donne, when we get to John Donne, we'll get to John Donne, I promise. He had probably not read a Kempis, but he had read his Luther. And so we sort of get, I'm not claiming there's a direct connection between the tradition of Imitatio Crucis and Christi to Donne in his own thought, but we can see it in the poem, and it is certainly in his thought through people like Luther, whom he read and was impacted by. So when Kempis treats it, and I want to just sort of sum up this way, because I think this is sort of what we want to hold in our minds as the imitation of Christ as it is in the literature at this time. It treats how the inner life as well as the perceptions of our world are to be trained in imitation of Christ, to seek God in all, embracing joys and sorrow alike, with a mind that seeks its stability and solace in God. The Imitatio Christi comes in the last of the 4 treatises that's collected in the Imitation of Christ, where Thomas à Kempis turns to the altar and the sacrifice there, and looks at how the contemplation of Christ's sacrifice draws us into a practice that is more devoted to humility and the posture that is to be cultivated in terms of our own sufferings. So, there are a variety of texts throughout the Middle Ages that take up what a Kempis treats very much in an expository fashion. There are other things that treat it more creatively. The Dream of the Rood, and I'd originally thought we could do Dream of the Rood, which is an Old English poem about the cross, with the John Donne, but that was just wildly ambitious. But the Dream of the Rood is a fascinating poem because what you have is an individual having a dream of the cross speaking to him. And by the end of the poem, the cross's perceptions, the cross's reflections, and the vision and purpose of the dreamer have merged, so that the one becomes the other in some sense. Very clearly, Imitatio Christi. Then you also have in hagiography the life of St. Francis. I mean, that is Imitatio Christi. St. Bonaventure is definitely drawing on those resonances as he writes the life of St. Francis of Assisi. We are, however, sadly, going to skip over the entirety of the Middle Ages and go to the early 17th century, which is not something I do lightly. Middle Ages are too important to be skipped over, but we're going to do it today. So we're going to turn to John Donne's poem, and I put copies on the tables, or Ezra put copies on the table for you, because it is a poem that you just can't listen to and get. You actually need to look at it as well as hear it. But just a few things about Donne, just the historical context, which is important for what he is going to the cross for and why he talks about the cross as he does. He is writing at a moment of political ferment and religious ferment, obviously. He is born about 40 years after Henry starts to blow up the church in England, and he's born during the reign of Elizabeth in 1572. And by that time, the iconoclastic debate in England that was part of the Reformation had been seething. And Henry's children, there'd been this back and forth of what to do with images. Henry's immediate heir, Edward, had tried to go even further than his father in terms of purging imagery from the church. So crucifixes with crosses and crucifixes alike had been removed. Rood screens had been pulled out of churches, replaced notably by the royal arms, which is, I find, deeply problematic. And then also stained glass windows with the image of Christ on the cross. Those had been removed from many churches as part of this purge of what was seen as potential idolatry or a potential threat to the purity of the Christian perspective. Then Mary, when Edward had died, she tried to reassert things, and then when she died, Elizabeth tried to obliterate everything that Mary had done. So there'd been this back and forth, contentious period by the time that Donne is born. He is himself born to a Roman Catholic family. His mother was a direct descendant of the great humanist Thomas More, who had been executed by Henry because he would not acknowledge Henry as the head of the church. So he's born Catholic. We know that at some point in time he becomes an Anglican because of the position he takes with Sir Thomas Egerton, which he would not have been able to get if he had not been an Anglican by that time. He marries a woman in secret, Anne More, and they know that they'll never get her father's permission, so they marry in secret. He loses his position. Anne is not allowed to take her dowry with her into the marriage, and they live in penury for about 10 years. During that 10-year time, those are generally called the Mitcham years, And that's when we think this poem was written. We don't actually know because most of his poetry wasn't published in his life. It was just sort of passed around between friends. Some of his theological texts were published, and we can date those, but not the poetry. So after the Mitcham years, around 1607, I believe it is, or in the Mitcham years, his friends are trying to convince him to be ordained in the church. And he refuses because he doesn't actually feel like he's worthy of holy orders. 1614, James I, who is now king at this point in time, tells Donne that it's the holy orders or nothing. He will give him no other preferment other than holy orders. And 1615, Donne is ordained and becomes a priest. He will become first James I's private chaplain, one of his private chaplains, and then he'll be made the dean of St. Paul's Cathedral at a later point in time. So that's just a little bit of his life. But those years, the Mitcham years in which this was written, were extremely difficult years. They were in poverty. They lived only because they survived because of the friendship of people who were willing to be generous to them. Until he finally gets a post and patronage. All right, so the poem itself. Let's see. As we turn to the poem, just a brief word on the fact that it is a metaphysical poem. Donne is a metaphysical poet. And I think the most concise way of understanding metaphysical poetry is that it is trying to translate the world of abstract thought into the world of the senses to make it somehow concrete and understandable. Eliot sums it up this way. It is a characteristic that elevates sense for a moment to regions ordinarily attainable only by abstract thought. Or, on the other hand, it clothes the abstract for a moment with all the painful delight of the flesh. And Eliot is the one who says that the ultimate metaphysical statement is the word made flesh. You know, that translation of something that is beyond expression, beyond thought, beyond comprehension of any sort, becoming knit up in human flesh, the sense, and thus can be understood in that way. So sort of take that as your primer and your summation, all you're going to get on metaphysical poetry today. All right, so let me just read a little bit read the poem. I'm going to read it in its entirety for you. A few things to think about as you're listening. Line 32 in the poem is the exact halfway point, and it is a turning point. The first half of the poem is focusing on the physical, but you'll notice there isn't a whole lot of actual description of any crosses in here. But it focuses on the material. And then the second half focuses more on the spiritual. Another thing to listen for as you're reading along is the play between all of the multiple meanings of the word cross. I mean, cross obviously can be both a verb and a noun, and he plays with that. Even when it's being used grammatically in one function, you hear the echoes of the other at work. And then just thinking about the word as a noun, there are multiple meanings there. There is the cross itself, just the cross. There's the mark. There is the cross understood as a symbol of Christ's atonement. There is the cross as a symbol of Christ's sufferings, of our sufferings, the blending of the two. So all of those meanings. And Donne is playing with all of them and multiple layers of them as we go through. So let me read it through, and then we're going to sort of take our time with the poem. Since Christ embraced the cross itself, dare I his image, the image of his cross deny? Would I have profit by the sacrifice and dare the chosen altar to despise? It bore all other sins, but is it fit that it should bear the sin of scorning it? Who from the picture would avert his eye, how would he fly his pains, who there did die? From me no pulpit, nor misgrounded law, nor scandal taken shall this cross withdraw. It shall not, for it cannot. For the loss of this cross were to me another cross. Better were worse, for no affliction, no cross is so extreme as to have none. Who can blot out the cross, which the instrument of God doed on me in the sacrament? Who can deny me power and liberty to stretch mine eyes and mine own cross to be? Swim, and at every stroke thou art thy cross. The mast and yard make one where seas do toss. Look down, thou spiest out crosses in small things. Look up, thou seest birds raised on crossed wings. All the globe's frame and spheres is nothing else but the meridians crossing parallels. Material crosses then good physic be, but yet spiritual have chief dignity. These for extracted chemic medicine serve, and cure much better and as well preserve. Then are you your own physic, or need none, when stilled or purged by tribulation. For when that cross ungrudged unto you sticks, then are you to yourself a crucifix, as perchance carvers do not faces make, but that away which hid them there do take. Let crosses so take what Christ hid in thee, and be his image, or not his, but he. But as oft alchemists do coiners prove, so may a self-despising get self-love. And then, as worst surfeits of best meats be, so is pride issued from humility, for 'tis no child, but monster. Therefore, cross your joy in crosses, else 'tis double loss, and cross thy senses, else both they and thou must perish soon, and to destruction bow. For if thy eyes seek good objects, and will take no cross from bad, we cannot escape a snake. So, with harsh, hard, sour, stinking, cross the rest. Make them indifferent, call nothing best. But most the eye needs crossing, that can roam and move. To the others the objects must come home. And cross thy heart, for that in man alone pants downward and hath palpitation. Cross those dejections when it downwards tends, and when it to forbidden heights pretends. And as the brain through bony walls doth vent by sutures, which a cross's form present, so when thy brain works, ere thou utter it, cross and correct concupiscence of wit. Be covetous of crosses, let none fall. Cross no man else, but cross thyself in all. Then doth the cross of Christ work fruitfully within our hearts, when we love harmlessly that cross's pictures much, and with more care that cross's children, which our crosses are. All right. All clear? Okay. It is a beautifully complex poem, and it starts off with this play of image and reality. So sort of this dual thing where he's saying that being the image of God himself, how dare he, an image, reject another image? And that will be taken up at the very end when he's talking about the cross's children, who are also images. So there's that first layer, that split of having benefited from the cross. One cannot deny it on the basis of it being an image. And then we are the images of God. And the rejection of imaging God in some sense is implicated. A rejection of the cross is a rejection of our own identity in Christ. All right, so bearing all other sins, we cannot load it with scorn of we cannot load it with the sin of scorning the cross. What follows there, who from that picture would avert his eye? How would he fly his pains, who there did die? That determination to look on the sufferings of the cross and to thus enter into the sufferings of the cross by meditating on it. This is our duty. This is what we are called to, in some sense, as Christians. And so he takes this stand where he will apply, he will adhere himself to to the cross, and he will not be guided by any earthly law, be it confessional, creedal, some abjuration of preachers of the cross, or be it legal. And crosses actually would be, in 1640, they would be prohibited. The Puritan Parliament would demand that all crosses and crucifixes be destroyed. So he's holding steadfastly to that efficacy of the cross. And then you have that lovely reference to the sign of the cross, baptism, line 15 and 16. And he wasn't, at this point, a priest, I don't think. If this was written during the Mitcham years, he hadn't been ordained yet. But he's recognizing that priests, as the instrument of God, doing chrism oil, on making the sign of the cross in baptism, is one of those moments. And you think about the words of that, you know, you are signed and sealed as Christ's own forever. And that, to him, is a tie that binds you to that. It is interesting that the Puritans preached against the sign of the cross being used at baptism, and they tried to get it outlawed at the turn of the century in the 1600, 1603, somewhere around there. They were working at that. Didn't get past that point in time. Then this piling up of images. Who can that image of one stretching out one's arms and embracing the cross, reflecting back to Christ himself in the very first line, embracing the cross. And then this picture of the world around us, the material world around us, is filled, utterly filled. One only has to open one's eyes, and the cross is everywhere manifest. From our own physical bodies, swimming, to the seas, and I think we're supposed to understand metaphorically the tempests of life, and the cross is there. Look down, dejection perhaps. Thou spiest out crosses in small things. Look up, hope. You see birds raised on crossed wings. It's everywhere. So he builds up this multiplicity of images, and these lines have a sort of speed to them when you read them. And I think that the sense is there that this piling of images is to invest the reader with a sense that it is undeniable. The image is everywhere if one only will look. It is woven into the very fabric of our world with the meridians crossing parallels. But then just saying the absolute inescapability of the cross in our world, he then turns it and says that it gives chief value to spiritual crosses rather than these material crosses. In the embrace of one's trials, therefore extracted chemic medicines serve, and cure much better and as well preserve. Then are you your own physic. And lines 25 and 29 and 32 sort of tie together, physic, crucifix. You know, the spiritual efficacy of willingly taking up one's sufferings. That when we focus on Christ in that, we become our own crucifix, and there is a merging then. It sticks to us. The cross ungrudged sticks when we have that willingness to enter into sufferings. It adheres to us, we adhere to it, and we cling. And with that, Donne then transforms, he turns and inserts this image that is unlike anything we've had thus far, a different type of art, not the cross anymore, but this image of the stone carver. And if you heard Jim Zingarelli's talk a few weeks ago, he showed that image of the cross, or his crucifix, and he showed both the before, while he was working on it, and the after, when it was done. And he talked about subtraction, taking off the layers. And that's exactly what Donne is talking about here. He's talking about we are those images of stone, and the cross is sort of the chisel that's working out those layers at us. So apophatic or negative theology, if you will, that it's the removal that actually defines the thing. It is that which is not. So by taking that away, we are then revealed as what hid Christ in thee. And it's interesting that line 35, it's what hid Christ in thee. It's not, it plays a lot with word order, but it is not what Christ hid in thee. It's what hid Christ in thee. So the identification is with us in Christ, and that is, he's with us behind this, this stone of life that we are, and then the cross will chisel away and will slowly reveal that we are Christ's own, and that we are like Christ in that. That then follows a warning right after that. And it's a sort of complex warning, but the idea is that we can make ourselves into idols of a sort. Just as the cross can be made into an idol, so too we can make ourselves an idol. And that's what these lines are getting at. Like crosses, so take what hid Christ in thee, and be his image and not his but he. But as oft alchemists do coiners prove, those who are doing the work, and they come up with something false. So may a self-despising get self-love. And then as worst surfeits of best meat be, so is pride issued from humility. So the danger is that we may, in our life with Christ, sever off the thing that we are working for from God. Give it a life of its own. Give our holiness, our pursuit, whatever it is, sort of see it as its own thing. And look at ourselves and say, oh, well done me. I navigated that pretty well. Whew. And rather than seeing everything as connected to, intimate with, and a gift of God. So that if we ever see the solace and stability as our own work, rather than the work of God, then we've made that into an idol. So, he says in line 41, cross your joy in crosses, else 'tis double loss, and cross thy sense. Cross everything. So sanctify both your understanding of life in Christ, sanctify your use of material crosses so that they do not become idolatry. And that's one of the layers here. But the sanctification of what is internal, that cross that you are adhering to is always Christ's cross. That when you become the cross, you are reflecting him and not yourself. And this warning, he then sort of moves more deeply and more deeply within the Christian. So first going through circumstances, then going into the senses. So circumstances, that which is around us, then the senses with which we engage our world, and then into our internal selves. And just going through this a little bit. Cross your joy in crosses, else 'tis double loss, and cross thy senses, else both they and thou must perish soon, and to destruction bow. For if the eye seek good objects, and will take no cross from the bad, we cannot escape a snake. So with harsh, hard, sour, stinking, cross the rest. Make them indifferent, call nothing best. And there are two passages here where he's going to refer sort of back to Eden and the fall. But here there is that if you only look for the good, if you refuse to engage with that which is struggle, that's the way to hell. You cannot escape the snake because they come together. And you can sort of hear St. Paul saying, I determined to know nothing but Christ crucified. That's implicit in these lines here. Accept the good, accept the bad, cross all. Make them indifferent, call nothing best. So those are the circumstances that we must engage with, and engage with that humility before all crosses. Then the eye and the senses. Most the eye needs crossing that can roam and move. To the others, the objects must come home. The eye can go out, and it can lead us astray. Other senses, things have to come a little closer, but the eye is particularly dangerous in Donne's perspective because it has such a range of possibility before it. Cross thy heart, for that in the man alone pants downward and hath palpitation. Some people read this as being referenced by Donne to our baser instincts, and those have to be redeemed and that sort of thing. I don't actually think that's what he means. And the reason I don't think that is because of what follows. Because what follows is crossing the dejections. He goes to the depths and the heights to which we as human beings are subject to fall. Cross those dejections when it, the heart, downward trends, and when it to forbidden heights pretends. And skip down, concupiscence of wit, cross and correct concupiscence of wit. I think these are references both to despair and back to lapsarian pride, that ambition beyond. The concupiscence of wit, concupiscence being simply disordered desire, and wit at this time, the word has more meaning than it has in our day. In our day, we tend to think of it as, cleverness, that sort of thing. It was getting that meaning. This is the time when it's beginning to accrue that meaning. But it still had very much in Donne's day the sense from the Old English, from the Germanic witan, to understand. So it really means the core of the mind and mental understanding, your mental capacity. So concupiscence of wit is a disordered desire for greater understanding, ambition beyond what we have the right to understand, which is the fall. We can become like gods. So this is his second reference to the fall, escape the snake and concupiscence of wit. And so when he's talking about crossing the heart, which hath palpitation, it's that it has that uncertainty, it has that turmoil of both falling down to the depths and having this ambition beyond what it is actually capable of pretending to these heights. So those two things in opposition to one another are those things to which we are subject as human creatures. And then you have those, we move into the final lines. Be covetous of crosses, let none fall. Cross no man, but cross thyself in all. Obviously using different versions of the cross there. Then doth the cross of Christ work fruitfully within our hearts, when we love harmlessly the cross's pictures, and with more care that cross's children, which our crosses are. And I want us sort of corporately to go through those final lines rather than, I've gone through a lot of the poem for you, but I'd like to throw out those final 6 lines and have you guys tell me what you think he is doing as he tries to sum up this movement of the poem, this reflection on the efficacy and the justice of the image of the cross as both a source of solace and a focus of imitation. What do you think he's trying to do in these final lines here?
Liesl, is the first word of line 64 as printed that, or is it the as you just read it?
Oh, it's that.
It is that, okay.
It is that. Yes. Sorry.
exactly what he's saying here, but I was really struck by the reference to the children at the end. The children are an extension of us, perhaps the most fragile and important cross we bear to raise those children.
Yeah. Yeah.
Lisa, could you repeat what you said?
Yes. Paul was saying that he was struck by that reference to the cross's children, and that they are the most fragile and vulnerable that we have to bear and raise up. Interesting choice of raise. You know, a cross is raised up, and a cross is born. Yeah. Other things in there. Just because I tend to be a bit of a misanthrope, you know, I read that final line, that crosses children, which our crosses are, you know, the call to love our neighbors as ourselves, I think is clearly implicit there, but also the recognition that nothing's harder than people. You know, they are our crosses to bear. I think that's in that final line there.
Well, especially if you have children and they suffer, which they did a lot more than the infant mortality was a fact of life.
Yeah.
That would be a terrible cross to bear.
Yeah.
Because the worst form of grief is a parent's loss of a child.
Yep. Yeah. And you can think of the cross's children as you know, done as a father of 12, only 7 of which made it to adulthood. You know, he would have known that, but he also would have known and seen the violence around him of Christian upon Christian during the Reformation and the upheaval. I mean, more Christians were killed under Elizabeth than under Mary. You know, Mary's called Bloody Mary because she didn't get to stay on the throne very long. Elizabeth, if somebody else had come along who was a Catholic and had the throne afterwards, Elizabeth probably would have been called Bloody Elizabeth as well, because of so many people dying under her reign. So you know, there was ferment, and there was a lot of uncertainty in that. So that notion of loving harmlessly, being able to observe the cross and use the cross, which is an instrument of death, you know, for it to be a source of fecundity, of fruitfulness, is a beautiful paradox. But it's not just within an individual's heart, the heart of the individual Christian, that harmlessness is supposed to translate into our relationship with one another as well. Even if other people are really hard sometimes. And they would have been extremely hard in this sort of political moment of ferment when people were so opposed to one another. Yeah.
Lisa, I'm sorry for stupid questions here, but in the last
No stupid questions.
in the last 2 lines, the word crosses appears plural with a capital C 3 times. Do we take those as nouns in all 3 cases?
Let's see. It is, in line 61, it is definitely a noun. Cross of Christ. The crosses...
63 and 64.
Crosses picture, cross is a noun. Crosses children, cross is a noun. Which our crosses are, that's a noun as well.
And is there any punctuation that in modern English we would apply?
Other than the possessives, you mean? And the
Apostrophes.
and the apostrophes. I think just the crosses. I mean, in terms terms of commas to sort of help sort it out. Does Christ work fruitfully within our hearts, comma, when we love harmlessly, that crosses picture much, comma, and with much care that crosses children, comma, and then that final sort of parenthetical, which our crosses are. I don't know, what did she ask the question?
Well, if we read this, that crosses pictures much, we have a plural followed by a verb which appears to be singular, which begs the question of whether pictures is a noun rather than a verb.
I think pictures is a noun.
Okay.
And I think it's referring to all of those things that were the subject of the iconoclastic debates. The crosses themselves, the stained glass, crucifix.
Okay. So we
Yeah.
can impute an apostrophe after the third S in line 63's second word. That it's two nouns, one followed by the other.
Yeah.
It's plural crosses, and
Oh, I think it's singular crosses.
okay.
The cross is pictures.
Okay, so it's an
Yeah.
apostrophe before the third S in that word, and it's possessive of the word pictures.
Yes.
It's two nouns,
Yes.
and there's a possessive character to
Yes.
the word crosses.
Sorry. Yes.
Okay, thank you. I know it's a stupid question.
No.
So that crosses,
Punctuation was much more flexible then.
yeah, that crosses pictures much,
Yeah.
and with more care, that crosses children. Again, there appears to be a missing apostrophe before the third S.
It's
That crosses children,
yeah.
which our crosses are.
Yes.
Do I have it right?
Yes.
So the two critical
Yes.
apostrophes are published in invisible ink.
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry.
I'm sorry, again, a stupid question. Line 37, what is the meaning of the word coiners? Is that a forger?
It means that rather than turning out gold, they're just turning out cheap pennies. So alchemists do coiners prove. They're no more than, somebody who's just stamping things. They're not actually doing what they want to do. Alchemists want to make gold out of whatever, and they turn out dross instead. So coiners is simply the noun for those people who make pennies, make coins of any sort.
But imputed to be coins of little intrinsic value.
Little value whatsoever.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just an observation. I love the fact that in this, the spelling of this text, the word cross has a rose in it.
Has a what?
A rose.
Yes, it does.
Seems fitting somehow. It stood the test of time.
It's a lovely thought, Paul. Yeah. Any other thoughts on that last bit, or any questions about the general poem?
So, in your focus on it, is it fair to read the word harmlessly, this missing S, as being far more benign as an adverb than we use it today?
It means, we use it today in the sense of, absence of anything doing damage. They would have understood it then as with a little more gravitas to it. We love, without harm to ourselves, the pictures of the cross. we can reverence those pictures of the cross without any injury to our souls.
But the fruit of that loving harmlessly is far more significant than what we today associate with the word, the adjective harmless,
Yes.
or the adverb harmlessly.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's
It's a word that's diminished.
much diminished today, and he appears to imply not only the health of images, but the fecundity of images.
Yes, yes, yeah. That paradox is very clearly there, that the instrument of death is the source of fecundity and fruitfulness and healing. Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of the direction I was going to ask you, if you would expound a little bit on the context of the Reformation and that almost mania for purity. Do you think Donne was trying to counteract that?
I think Donne was very much he did not see necessary harm in images, the way Elizabeth didn't. Elizabeth saw no nascent threat in the image of a cross. It was a lot of her counselors and a lot of people around her who saw that threat. But Donne didn't. He thought that the cross could be a useful instrument of focus, but it isn't, but not, I'm going to phrase this in the negative, that it did not necessarily lead into the development of superstitions around the image itself as efficacious, but rather what it points to. So very much sort of the Augustinian sign versus the thing itself. Yeah. If that makes sense. Yeah. So I think that even though we have no implications that the Imitatio Christi theme was something that Donne himself had ever really contemplated as Kempis had contemplated it at length and written about it, it is one that I think we can clearly see shaping both his own thought of his life and his poetry, and how he would engage with images that were contested at his time and with their spiritual efficacy for drawing us more closely into the imitation of Christ. And you hear echoes of this in one of his sermons. I'm just going to read a bit from it. So this would have been written years after, we think, when this poem was written. He said, "I may have as much knowledge as is presently necessary for my salvation, and yet have restless and unsatisfied desire to search into unprofitable curiosities, unrevealed mysteries, and inextricable perplexities." I love his language. "And on the other side, a man may be satisfied and thinks he knows all, when God knows he knoweth nothing at all. For I know nothing, if I know not Christ crucified, and I know not that, if I know not how to apply him to myself." So, I think it's there. So, yes, I encourage you. I think that one of the secrets to reading Donne is just to read him over again and again and again and again. Because the first go through, it's like, what the dickens is the man saying, you know? And by the time you've read it through about 3 times, it's like, oh, you know, and then you begin to see the connections. I mean, there's so much more here that I haven't even gotten into in terms of how he's connecting the second half with the first half. and referring back. Yeah, Becky.
I would also just add what you said, reading over again, but also having a commentary like the two gave us in terms of the historic content
Yeah.
and context. And
Yeah, context
his
matters.
context too, in terms of more fully knowing him. And who would you recommend for that in terms of secondary sources?
Yeah, there's a new book that just came out, Kristen Sterling, in March of this year, on images and his use of images in both his sermons and his poetry, which is interesting. But there are, there is so much. I actually think one of the, you can get the big commentaries, you can get the big editions, but if you have access to the library system online, I think one of the easiest ways is just to go to something like JSTOR and look up the specific poem, and then you'll get a plethora of articles that will take different angles on it. And sometimes that's actually better than reading just one commentator's opinion, because you get some of the debate that's going on between people, how different scholars are connecting it into the historical context. Because, people read Donne differently. He gets dated differently. There used to be, I'll give you one example, there used to be this commonly accepted belief that his poetry could basically be divided in half. There was the racy stuff from the early years, and then when he became ordained, the holy sonnets and all the rest of it. And, about 20 years ago, somebody was like, why? Why aren't they together? Why do we see a bifurcation between these two halves of this man? And so there was a reassessment that was really constructive in terms of reconciling those two sides of himself, because they do reflect on each other and they do weave in really interesting ways. And so I think that's one of the benefits of just sort of looking at what's recently out rather than just one big whopping commentary from way back. So that would be my recommendation. Yeah. Yeah.
That separating out of his erotic poems
Yeah.
and his religious poems, as though one is better than the other, is part of a modern prejudice about religion being somehow stereotyped as anti-erotic,
Yeah.
which is false.
Yeah.
The Bible is loaded with erotic imagery, and in
Yeah.
fact, the ultimate erotic image is Christ in the church as a bride and a bridegroom. He doesn't say he's the husband and she's the wife.
Yeah.
He refers to the church as
Bride.
bride. And there's something very special about that bridegroom and bride relationship, and there's a lot of erotic religious poetry
Mhm.
by a lot of the saints. John of the Cross, St. Teresa of Avila,
Yeah.
ton of that.
Yeah.
So it's just a stereotyping of religion as somehow this sort of puritanical end of desire or something.
And we have the irony in the modern world of when we've sort of tried to expunge religious language to find something that is now transcendent. We have to go to sex. It's the new transcendent. Or art. Art has to fulfill that. Visual art has to fulfill that, which is a pretty heavy lift.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Anything else? Yeah.
Sorry, I missed the first 5 minutes. So the Puritans were trying to take the crosses out of the church? Is that what
Yeah. When you have the Reformation debates coming in the 1400s from the continent, their debate about the role of images is very significant. It's attached to assumptions of idolatry, misguided superstition, etc. And so those debates predate Henry VIII. But when he starts dissolving the monasteries, that's when you start to begin to get more and more of it. But it goes beyond the church, because there were debates about the place of crosses in marketplaces. And crosses had always been put up in marketplaces throughout England and at crossroads as well, sort of sanctifying markers of things. And you have crosses in marketplaces being torn down. You have a 50-year debate about the Cheapside cross, the famous cross, where it gets damaged repeatedly. And Elizabeth actually has it restored. And then in the, 1630 or something like that, it finally gets taken down. But the people, the town council at one point in the early 1600s, they were like, well, we should take down the cross and put up an obelisk instead as our marker. So you have this sort of rampant desacralization that goes alongside this, the Puritan movement, which is fascinating. So in some ways, the Reformation actually paves the way for secularization. But that's a different discussion entirely. Yeah. So, all right. I think we probably need to get to church. Thank you very much.